Really very excited to have the opportunity to hear from and showcase the Anti-Eugenics Collective at Yale, who will be discussing interrogating university histories to build just futures. And in that context, I'm thrilled to introduce my colleague Dan HoSang, a very accomplished teacher, professor of American Studies at Yale, and the author and editor of many books, including A Wider Type of Freedom, How Struggles for Racial Justice Liberate Everyone. Dan designed and has led the Anti-Eugenics Collective at Yale, a reckoning with histories of enslavement, appropriation, and other forms of domination that's brought together students, local K-12 teachers, and New Haven residents in exciting ways. You'll hear today more about how they worked and what they've done, and I'm grateful to Dan and everyone on the panel for being here. Please join me in welcoming all of them. Thanks.
Thank you. Is that? Flip it up. All right. Saturday afternoon energy. There we have. Steve, everybody here deserves like an extra cheese plate at the reception, okay? I'm really grateful for everyone being here, a chance to share our work with us. I'm gonna introduce you quickly to my colleagues here, talk a little bit about the scope of what we're gonna share with you today. We're gonna take a break like halfway through to take some questions and maybe talk to a neighbor. I'm in this program now at Yale where in lieu of my teaching, I'm taking classes by colleagues. And the thing I'm struck with is how do you sit for an hour and 20 minutes and not move? So new sympathy for students, and like these rooms are not designed for, what it's to be. So we'll keep it moving that way. So really quickly, I'll first start introducing Maya Manthrop and Dara Bhatt. Maya and Dara are both seniors. Dara is a political science major. Maya is a history of science and medicine major. They've been active in the Anti-Eugenics Collective at Yale. It's an effort to take, as we'll describe, Yale made these really foundational contributions to the American eugenics movement that we'll describe. They continued after the kind of eugenics project was formally discredited. And so we reckon with not just the history, but its afterlives in many aspects. Then I'm really happy to introduce Marco Sanabre. Marco is a New Haven Public School graduate, a longtime teacher, English and literary studies teacher in New Haven Public Schools, and he now serves as the lead English teacher for 6 through 12 education in New Haven and has been engaged with the project. And finally, Dr. Ilana Slavin is a third-year resident in the Yale School of Med and Psychiatry program. She's helped us lead workshops that we'll talk about for medical residents and clinicians about how the afterlives of eugenics affects medical care today. Okay, so that's the scope. I want to just say 3 quick things. Now I'm coming back to the podium because this is serious stuff here. I want to just say 3 quick things. The what of eugenics. So if you get anything maybe from your 11th grade social studies or US history class, it's this term from the late 19th and early 20th century. It's often associated with this kind of pseudoscience that was way out there. They're trying to engineer people, select genes. Horrific for the time. Thank goodness we don't do it today. We want to say, I think the easiest way that when I try to get my head around it, the term eugenics was meant to be, it's a made-up word, syllogism. Eugenics, birth, by a 19th century, pseudoscientist himself. But the idea that you could explain social inequality through the body, that was not invented in the 19th century. There's a long, that's the history of enslavement, dispossession, etc. So the term actually activates a much longer ideological idea. And I just want to say for our theme around democracy, it exemplifies anti-democracy, anti-democratic commitments, because the idea is not everyone is fit for democracy, capable of it. C.L.R. James had this book, Every Cook Can Govern, or this essay. The eugenicists believe the opposite. Most people are not capable of having authority over their lives, collective authority. The second thing is the why. Why spend time in this history? Because I think it teaches us that authoritarianism is not just out there. It's not just in one party, in one candidate, at one site. Authoritarianism comes from our institutions as well. And we can inhabit it too. We can inhabit hierarchical ideas that deny other people the right to self-governance. And when we're thinking about teaching it, we have to be very careful not to constantly think the problem is out there. Sometimes the problem is in with all of us. Right? The third is the how. Our obligations, not just to develop our programs, which are important, but to share and to be accountable to publics outside the university. If the eugenicists took these ideas about anti-democracy and spread them out, we have an obligation to attend to what they did. So that's to frame the larger kind of stakes of the project. Where's the clicker? All right, clicking away. So in today's session, I'm going to start with, and Maya and Thar are going to talk about, to give you a little sense of the history of eugenics at Yale and the formation of this collective. Then we'll have some time for discussion, and then we'll turn to Alana and Marco's after. Okay? So I want to just share this. We've done this workshop, and when the students first started doing this, there was a really important commitment they had to say, we can't just present this to the university and ask for some 3-line apology and a plaque somewhere. They said, we have to take the ideas and spread them outwards as we're learning about them ourselves. So what you'll see the next kind of 10 or 15 slides are examples of workshops we've done in dozens of departments across campus, in the medical school, colleagues in molecular biology, genetics, internal medicine, pediatrics, et cetera, to try to introduce this history to them. Okay? So this is the New Haven Green in 1919. For those in New Haven, it looks much the same way today. This address, 185 Church Street, the building is no longer extant, was the headquarters of an organization called the American Eugenics Society. And it was headquartered on the Green for almost 20 years, from the 20s to the 1930s. This photo is of a group of more than 100 leading scientists of the day, taken about 100 years ago at the Museum of Natural History, that beautiful building on Central Park West. Some of you in the area might have gone to field trips. They were gathered for a huge international conference convened by academics, the Second International Congress on Eugenics. And so I just want to say it's very important that here are ideas about deficiency, dehumanization, emanating not from out there, from in here, from the university. They're disseminated out that way, you know? One of the key attendees was an economist who worked at Yale, I think arguably the most influential economist. Yale still, the department still claims his work is still taught, Irving Fisher, who had long supported eugenics ideas and said this stuff is good, but it doesn't matter if we can't spread it broadly. The public needs to know about eugenics. We need an organization to help explain eugenics to everyday people. And Fisher, this is also, I just want to show, this was a diagram that they created for the program book for this conference. And what do you see in the roots there? What are those? They're academic disciplines. They're all the academic disciplines that we still have today. Statistics, psychology, biology, physiology, etc. So the point I just want to, by their own terms, eugenics is not a side project. Eugenics comes from all of the disciplines. It draws methods, insights, commitments, and it will in turn shape the disciplines. It is not something afar from the university. It's in all of our work, our methods, our research, our ways of thinking, etc. So it makes sense then when Fisher says we need an organization to bring it to a university, and to bring it to a university that they understood had some prestige, like Yale. So Fisher actually, its first headquarters is at his house on Prospect Street. Kind of sets it up in his home office, I think. But soon, he and his colleagues are writing to scholars all over the country, academics, scientists, saying, quote, America needs to protect herself against indiscriminate immigration, criminal degenerates, and race suicide. The time is right for a strong public movement to stem the tide of threatened racial degeneracy. So again, for all of the booming nativist xenophobic rhetoric that we hear even in our own moment, it almost in some ways can't match this. Someone like Fisher never would have associated with a group like the Klan that was quite active then, but he was very committed to saying this is science. It comes from sound reason, you know? And he's putting this call out. All these archives are here at Yale, and they've, you know, students have engaged a lot of them, and they're documented in this way. You'll see, I mean, this is the letterhead of the advisory committee by 1926, leading scientists, researchers, and scholars across many disciplines. They said, we need to give this movement scientific credibility. That's why the public will trust it. Okay, so they're very, very conscious about this. They were prolific kind of communicators, so we can just take on their own, what is eugenics? They say here, quote, all men are not created equal. Many a person is tragically destined to be mediocre or even degenerate, in spite of exceptional training and opportunity. This is not a science of anything. It's an account, it's a kind of a philosophical account of degeneracy. And the idea that it's not worth investing equally in everyone's development and learning. That idea did not die with the discredit of the eugenics movement. It's very much alive today. So that's part of what we're trying to do, is figure out, how does the movement kind of lose the battle, but in some ways win the war? Just to say a couple of things that happened when the eugenics project was quite active. They sponsored these fitter family contests. So just like you could enter a chicken or a guinea pig or a goat at a state fair, you could also enter your family, small, medium, or large. Public health or social workers would measure your head, your skull, ask you questions about your parents or lineage, and award this medal, designed here in New Haven and sent out. And so the archives are filled with their appeals to state fairs. We have everything ready, the whole display. Can we bring it to you? To teach people the science of hereditary indifference, why the body guarantees something about your social status. They sponsored sermon contests. You can see this one, evaluated by an esteemed professor of literature at Yale. Preachers and some rabbis sent sermons in to be judged. They published textbooks. There was classes on eugenics here, and by their count, hundreds all over the country where you'd learn. No one learned about about genetics, absent eugenics in the 20s and 30s. They were always joined together. This is a graphic done by one of our students, Dorgo, showing the spread of eugenics leadership from the university, the School of Forestry, the Child Studies Center, the Department of Psychiatry, Economics, Geography, Pediatrics, Anthropology, Peabody, all exchanged, and again, all documented in the archives. And you'll see there in the 1930s, 3 Yale faculty on the board of directors. Some of the work, just among many, to show, this is Milton Winternitz, the first Jewish dean of the Yale Medical School, responsible really for the modernization, who was also on the board of the American Eugenics Society. And student research has really documented his role, actually, in promoting anti-Semitic and anti-Black admissions policies in the School of Medicine itself. Arnold Gessel, who's understood as the father of child development, a really important figure in our world-famous Child Studies Center, also really, really connected to notions of measuring, differentiation, etc., some of which Dr. Slavin will talk about. By the late 1920s, the American eugenics movement is under increasing attack. Scientists, geneticists are saying there's no underlying empirical basis for this. You shouldn't be making these claims. This is the president of Yale at the time, James Rolangel, who says, the eugenics movement in this country has suffered somewhat, at least among the well-educated, from the suspicion of sentimentality and of scientific superficiality. But be that as it may, no thoughtful person can have the slightest doubt that the problem of selecting the better and suppressing the poorer stocks must be given exhaustive study. And you see this time and time again. The project gets discredited, we must persist. At Yale, the way that form of kind of endurance or persistence took was in this And this is still, for people who go to the medical school, this beautiful wrought iron arch reads the Institute of Human Relations. And it was funded by a large $7.5 million in 1929 dollars from the Rockefeller Foundation, where they said very clearly, you cannot call this eugenics. And when people lobbied Yale to have a chair of eugenics, they said, we can't do that anymore. But trust us, this is, and a student found this incredible letter. It's the case of a rose smelling sweeter by another name. We will still be able to do work on differentiation. We will make Yale our laboratory. They test every public school student in New Haven to understand the relationship between variance and achievement. So this is a key moment when the kind of more overt supremacist gets sublimated into everyday things about test scores, difference, etc. This is still there, and I would say 98% of the people that walk through that every day can't even recall what it says, let alone its own history. Another incredible find from students in the archive, this is from 1942, the New Haven Committee of the American Eugenics Society. As the horrors of the Holocaust are coming into consciousness, still holding events here in New Haven, featuring the president, the dean of the medical school, etc. So the idea that it just got disavowed and people walked away from it is not borne out by the records here. The American Eugenics Society continues under the same name until 1973. It changes its name then. It's not as active today, but it still continued to have contributions from many, many fields. And we'll talk about those. All right, I'll just say this quickly. We talk about the afterlives of eugenics across many fields. Marriage and family counseling, started by Paul Popenoe, the idea of mating ideally situated people. Criminology and incarceration, as Tara will talk about, a long, long history of differentiating and distinguishing the future, the potential offender, and who's incorrigible. In museums and anthropology, they play an enormous role in the kind of classificatory moment. Statistics, distributions, variance, that all comes from eugenicists trying to account for comparing populations. The bread and butter of what's taught in intro class. Immigration policy, education and testing, as we'll hear from Marco. Psychology and mental health, the student mental health movement is born here at Yale. What happens when a Yale man's mind gets a little off kilter, but we shouldn't warehouse him? That's the origins of what was called mental hygiene. Music, having exceptional musical ability, and whether that's kind of hereditary. Reproductive health and policy, sterilizations, environmentalism, social science, and genetics. So all of these fields have these complicated histories. And we often just don't teach students the history of our fields, and so that's why it's often not legible to us. Okay, I'm going to now welcome Maya and Tara to talk about the kind of shared work, and just the last thing I'll say is students were the ones who insisted on this idea. No report, no meetings with the deans. We have to spread the work out laterally, and we have to do it collectively, and we have to think where the harm has been and what our obligations are to those sites. So join me in welcoming Tara and Maya. Yeah. You got to point that way, which I forget.
Okay. So as Professor HoSang alluded to, the eugenicists of the 20th century were not only concerned with questions of governance and policy, but also about bringing as many people as possible, as much of the public, into the project of eugenics and understanding the ideology of eugenics. So in the same way, the Anti-Eugenics Collective at Yale is concerned with teaching as many people as possible the history of eugenics and bringing as many people at Yale and beyond into the movement of anti-eugenics. And Maya and I will talk a little bit about the projects that we've been working on in the last couple of years. So one of our projects, or one of the things that we do is lead anti-eugenic campus tours. And these are some slides for our anti-eugenic campus tour booklet. And the idea of this is unlike a classic Yale tour where people come and they look at the beautiful buildings that Yale has and think about the awesome gyms and basketball courts and movie theaters and the basements of each residential college. We asked our participants to cast a critical glance back at the history of Yale and the history of the buildings that were inhabiting. So we start the tour at 185 Church Street, where the American Eugenics Society building once stood. and go to other sites of eugenics in New Haven, like the old psychology department and Institute of Human Relations, where eugenicists at Yale conducted research on residents of New Haven.
Another key part of the Anti-Eugenics Collective at Yale has been proposed reforms to the undergraduate biology curriculum. So the Bio 1 through 104 sequence is a year-long course that anyone who is attempting to major in the life sciences at Yale must go through. So in order to become a doctor or a researcher, they must take these classes, usually within their first years at Yale. And so something that started back in 2021 and is continued today is by students themselves coming together to think about how we can critically engage with the histories of eugenics and the life sciences. As mentioned earlier, the histories of genetics and biology can't really be separated from the histories of eugenics, especially at Yale. Here's a slide that's going further in depth into eugenics and the sciences, and on the right, you can see a picture of students who are presenting at Bulldog Days, which is the big admitted students weekend where prospective students who are thinking about coming to Yale can learn more about curriculum and what it's like to be a Yale student. This is a really great introduction to students who are not even on campus yet to realize the closeness between eugenics and sciences and realize that there's work that they can do even as a student to be a more critical scholar.
This is an exhibit at the Peabody Museum that students at AECY helped to build and helped formulate the language of. And it shows the multiple choice apparatus, which is an intelligence testing device that was created by a psychologist here in the 1920s, Robert Yerkes. So students helped formulate the language for this project is currently on display at Peabody, and it's the first institutional acknowledgement of Yale's history of eugenics.
Okay. So another part of the work we do at AECY is student presentations at conferences such as this, and conferences specifically that are not just about eugenics and social democracy, but also about science. So recently we spoke at the evolutionary biology department of history, and we've had a lot of positive discussion about presenting these ideas and encouraging people to critically engage with their fields of study and how it relates back to eugenics. We're really passionate about bringing other fields into this and realizing this is not just the work of historians, but everyone has a responsibility to engage with this. This is our website, anti-eugenicscollective.org. Here it hosts all of our student original scholarship. It also hosts the campus tour that we mentioned earlier. Here you can find blog posts, ones that I did and other students, also like legacies, which Laura and I will talk more about. And speaking of blog posts, I want to plug my own. And first, I'm going to ask a question to the audience, which is, has anyone ever seen flyers soliciting egg or sperm donations from college students? Yeah, I've seen a lot. And behind you is actually a specific targeted email that I received from someone who was asking for my Yale eggs. As you can see, I am doing well, and she goes on to specifically talk about why I, as a Yale student, would be specifically suited to donate eggs, and this goes back to a eugenic idea of heredity and what desirable qualities a person should have, and the idea that someone could purchase my eggs as a Yale student to endow these qualities to their child. So I wrote this blog post and collaborated with another student to create that drawing by Sora Park, and really interrogated the ways that students are pulled into these legacies and afterlives of eugenics in a sort of quotidian way.
Great. So along with work about the afterlives of eugenics, students in the collective have also spent a lot of time in the archives, both at Yale and around the country, writing their senior theses and other papers, and forming an account of how the eugenics movement gained so much power. So up on the slides are a few theses written by previous students about the Yale Child Study Center, about the Institute of Human Relations, about the environmental movement and the connection between the field of environmental science and eugenics, connections between the field of statistics and eugenics, and so on. And now Maya and I will talk about our own senior thesis research.
So this is a little sneak peek into my student thesis. As Professor HoSang mentioned, I am a senior in history, science, and medicine, and I'll be looking at variation in eugenic sterilization laws across the United States. So here we have a picture of Carrie and Emma Buck, who are the center of the landmark Supreme Court decision, Buck v. Bell, which allowed for sterilization of people involuntarily under the name of public health. And so people tend to think about eugenics in this sort of like top-down, monolithic way that is just coming from above and being placed directly onto the nation. But my project looks to interrogate that and see that that's plainly not true. There's lots of variation across the laws of the land. Specifically, I'll be looking at Connecticut and Oregon and seeing how eugenicists there really contour their policies and initiatives to shape the unique landscape of each state. So, eugenic laws regarding sterilization are very different in California versus North Carolina. There's different focuses on race versus disability versus like, sexual degeneracy that they all claim. And in the top right, you can see a map, which is the American Eugenics Society really taking measure of the different ways that states are implementing eugenic sterilization laws. And so yeah, I would be interrogating that and different legal bases for sterilization.
Beautiful. I'm a political science student, and I'm hoping and working on studying the connections between the 20th century eugenics movement and modern criminal law. So as Professor HoSang already alluded to, the eugenicists were quite concerned with questions of criminality and believed that people who committed illegal acts or committed crimes weren't just making an action, but rather were hereditarily and innately criminal. And although this point of view is mostly outmoded now, the practices that eugenicists used in connection to mass incarceration and criminalization continue to be used in modern criminal law. So my paper looks to form an account of how these practices continue to be in use. And some examples are intelligence testing and IQ, which was used by eugenicists to restrict immigration into the United States, to justify forced sterilization, institutionalization, and mass incarceration, and continue to be a tool that's used both to reduce sentences for criminal defendants and also to justify things like the death penalty and life sentences. As Maya just discussed, sterilization was a tool used by eugenicists broadly, and sterilization and surgical castration continues to be used on criminal defendants, specifically those with sex crimes. Another particularly salient example are habitual offender laws, also called three-strike laws, which were created and passed in legislation by eugenicists, and basically are the idea that if somebody commits a crime thrice, their commitment of that criminal act is not just a choice, but again, innate, and is used as justification to give people the death penalty and life sentences in the 20th century, and continue to stand in states like Colorado and Louisiana. And then finally, the continuation of this trust and authority of science, medicine, psychiatry in criminal science in the 20th century and modern day litigation and criminal sentencing. And if you're interested in signing up for our newsletter or visiting our website, you can do with our beautiful QR codes here.
So some of the slides you're going to see are from a series of workshops done with clinicians, so residents in psychiatry, the pediatrics program in the School of Medicine. We often start with this idea that the idea of care and coercion are opposed. So sure, the eugenicists, they detain, they sterilize, etc., but we don't do any of that. We care for people. That's what medicine is. So part of what we want to do is complicate that and say that care and coercion, right? You need to stay here for your own good, are intimately linked and have a much more complicated relationship. I just want to do this as these are photos from, I think this was one of the pediatrics workshops that you were in, but archivists in the Medical Historical Library there have been so generous in opening up the archives, arranging visits. So here, groups of residents come to see the eugenic archives in the School of Medicine. they see the diagnostics used to determine and make these determinations in these categories, and they reflect then on how they relate to clinical and research paradigms today. You can see the questions there, and we'll talk about those as well. So this is Alana leading one of the workshops, and I just want to say also, we will often in all these workshops get to the so what? What do we do now that we know this? And so having a clinician, a person who does clinical medicine, think, where is it decided when we take notes about a patient, when we think about diagnoses? That's part of the discussions that are happening here. So Alana, I'm really happy, she's going to kind of walk through both the intersections of clinical medicine and also share some examples of how she shares this work.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here. So I'm going to be talking about a few topics, but I think what's important is that, not everyone here is in clinical medicine. And I think really an important theme is to understand the way that academics has permeated and shaped this clinical thinking and perpetuates kind of this cycle of harm. And I think that that's really important. So kind of for context, I first got the lecture from Dr. HoSang. How I got interested in the work is he does a history of medicine lecture, which has some of the slides from earlier. And that was presented to the psychiatry residents. That has now been cut from our didactic curriculum due to some non-prioritization of that type of learning. So that is important context for this as well. But I decided to join this because I felt like it gave me the language to kind of express these things that I've been seeing in medicine for a long time. So my work is in childhood trauma. A lot of focus in child psychiatry is on how mothers and fathers, mostly mothers, traumatize children. And then kind of the research has been, for example, 40 years ago, they used to think that autism and schizophrenia were because of cold mothers. That a mother was not warm enough, and that was why the children developed these things. But I was so disturbed, and I've done work in Tijuana related to family separation under the Trump and Biden administration. And no one was talking about the ways that systems were traumatizing children. It was always just mothers, fathers, even in these contexts. So I had a conversation with an attending where a mother who was living in Mexico, who was an asylum seeker, wasn't able to afford food. And the kind of attending had said, she's not being a good mother. And we were talking about it. I said, what about family separation? And she's not with her child. How is that impacting their development? They said, well, that's not our territory. That's political. And so this idea that doctors are not political, even though we're enacting very political agendas, is something that's taught and is something that's instilled in academic medicine. And I think also very personally why I became interested in this research was, it was the first time I actually heard about the history of medicine in the medical school with the Jewish dean who barred Jews from entering the school. My grandfather was one of those people. He applied to the medical school, and he got a letter saying he was rejected because there were too many Jews. And so he didn't come here. And that was the first time I'd ever heard anyone talk about this history. So just a little bit of context about why I joined, and I think it's important. So the first thing we'll talk about is kind of the medical applications of eugenics and how eugenics has permeated medicine, because I think that's really important to think about. And the first is the idea of growth curves. I'm sure we've all heard of growth curves. If you have kids, they always track them. They always tell them exactly where they are. My sister was a 4th percentile in weight and a 95th percentile in height, and that is still told in our family kind of all the time, that story. So it's deeply ingrained, especially if you're a parent. My parents were panicking about it. They're saying, why is she so small? So this kind of growth curve is really a big part of medicine. And it was first created to give the idea that we should study the normal child in the same scientific study by research methods that we give to crops and cattle. So the CDC created in 1977 the initial growth curves. And those were actually created studying white, middle-class, formula-fed male infants from Ohio. So that was the demographic that they based all of their growth curves on. The World Health Organization then came out and said, growth curves are helpful, but they're arbitrary, and so we shouldn't use these as tools, but then published their own growth curves, which then were used as tools in a clinical setting. And so this kind of, you'll see the growth curves here. So a really common former diagnosis that they've now renamed because it fell out of favor was a term called failure to thrive. So that's a diagnosis. You tell your child they're failing to thrive, and then parents will get panicked because that is such a horrible name. So the definition is, it's actually seen in 5 to 10% of children, by the way, in primary care settings, this diagnosis, so it's very common. And the definition is weight for age, which is less than the 5th percentile on multiple occasions, or weight deceleration. Here you can kind of see this kid who's like leveling out a little bit in his weight gain. So those are the definitions. And the differential diagnosis that doctors will then look into is medical or psychosocial etiologies. And most commonly, if it's determined that it was a psychosocial etiology, meaning they didn't have access to food or they weren't being fed, the diagnosis then becomes neglect. And this is important because, framing this as neglect and a pathology within the family rather than in the system is rooted in eugenics. So about 50% of cases reported to DCF for neglect are due actually to poverty. Parents can't afford formula, they can't afford food, and then that is triggering a DCF investigation. And so there's a quote from an article by Dr. Raz that said, well, perhaps technically accurate, as the word neglect includes a broad spectrum of behaviors. Such announcements grossly overemphasize the prevalence of physical abuse. In fact, a significant proportion of the reports of child mistreatment at the time dealt with malnutrition. Children were going hungry primarily because their parents were poor. And so I think this ties to what we were talking about earlier with the creation of childhood protective services, who we were monitoring. And there's this idea, this article was actually about how families are being separated by child protective services, not just at the border. This also led to the idea of mental growth curves. These were popularized by the Yale Psychiatry Department. I'm sure many parents have heard by age 2, your child's supposed to be doing this. By 3, you're supposed to put 3 cubes in a street. It's just kind of those kind of things. And so this was a baby who was being studied at Yale, actually. And so it's an establishment of specific norms, schedules, and scales, but again was studied in white youth. And it was through this theory that they developed this idea that one should have developmental milestones that track progression and abnormality. But these were very arbitrary and used to diagnose children with conditions if they didn't meet these kind of standards. We touched on this earlier. The idea of IQ testing was also really preeminent and was popularized by medicine. And so it justified assumptions about innate racial or ethnic differences and was used to place those who lacked the means, connections, or skin color to become well-educated and well-employed at the bottom. That was an explicit goal of the IQ test creation. But unfortunately, then, medicine started using IQ tests. So this is an IQ test that's administered. It's really hard. I tried to do it yesterday, and I was struggling to get a lot of it done. It's utilized quite frequently in areas of medicine. The most common are psychiatry and forensics testing. So if someone makes a plea of being criminally insane, they'll use the IQ testing. And in OB-GYN and sterilization programs, when they decide whether women or those who have uteruses should be forcibly sterilized, they administer an IQ test to see if they have the competency to refuse the procedures. So that's kind of this theme here of this idea that states that allow for sterilization. And I think it's important to look at this map because I think a lot of times I would have thought maybe the South, frankly, as someone from St. Louis, Missouri, was kind of the area that was doing it. But the people who enacted the most harm were very kind of traditionally blue or democratic states, with California being actually the lead and kind of taking the lead in the number of sterilizations. I think that's important to name because I think we think that this is an idea that only the right wing does, but it's not. And so there's actually a really great documentary that covers it. It's called Belly of the Beast, and it goes over California's dark history of forced sterilizations. And I think it's important to know that now it's just kind of coded differently. These sterilizations are still happening, and the story I have, this is a third-year medical student, this was in 2021. I met with a woman who came in, she was 37 years old, African American, and she told me she was trying to get pregnant and couldn't. And I looked at her chart and I saw that she had a hysterectomy, which meant her uterus was removed. And I asked her if she knew that she had her uterus taken out, and she said she didn't. And she was told that she was getting a fibroid removal surgery, and that they didn't know that they took out the entire uterus. I then went to my attending, and she understood when I explained to her. I went to my attending and I expressed concern. This procedure was done at Michigan, University of Michigan, also a very blue state. And I brought up to them this concern, and they said, well, she probably has a low IQ, and she didn't understand. So these kind of ideas of who can engage in healthcare appropriately permeates medicine. So a modern correlate is also ADD and ADHD screening. So Gessel at Yale Child Study Center, he saw school as a site of intervention. And so Dr. HoSang talked about this earlier. But in 1918, they viewed New Haven kind of as this experimental playground, is what they termed it. And so they performed mental surveys of all 24,000 elementary students at the time in New Haven. And they were surveyed by teachers who were trained to perform tests of mental capacity. They would calculate the student's mental age and use forms to understand a child's home life, school history, social reactions, and school attainments. And then they would rank them. If they were mentally subnormal, as definitely deficient, very probably deficient, doubtful, or merely backwards. So those were the categorizations. And to be clear, that those were used in large part in coordination with Child Protective Services. And those who were deemed as definitely deficient or very probably deficient often had involvement of Child Protective Services. They did a lot of studies and found that hyperactivity, they determined, was the most crucial personality trait related to developing into a delinquent. And so Gessel actually said, I can tell as far back as the age of 4 years old if someone's likely to become a criminal when they're older. So they were studying these children in New Haven public schools and determining their risk of delinquency. And then these were used to create rankings of exceptional and deficient children, and that created a Commission of Child Welfare, Child Protective Services, and a Division of Exceptional Children. And so I actually was really perturbed. There was an earlier, kind of in the archival material, there was this little set of flashcards that you could go through. And I was going through them, and I was frankly laughing at some of the questions. They were like, have you burned down a barn? And I was like, this is such an oddly specific question. And then we kept going and going, and then there were things like, do you steal things of trivial value? Do you talk out of turn in class? And as I was doing it, me and my colleague looked at each other and we said, oh my God, this is the ADD questionnaire, just in form. And so you can look at the questions. So this is given to teachers. It's still used today. The questions include, do you interrupt or intrude other? Do you lose your temper? Do you defy or refuse to comply with adults' requests or rules? Are you angry or resentful? And then these teachers rank these children based on that. Then I think this is really bizarre, but they grade the children on their relationship with peers, whether they disrupt class, and rank them as excellent, above average, average, somewhat of a problem, or problematic. These are all subjective. There's no guidelines on how to answer these questions. And then they tally the score, and then that score gives you kind of a screen for whether you're likely to have ADD and ADHD. Now the parents complete the scores and the teachers, but I've been even told by psychiatrists that we take the teachers more seriously. But that's such an interesting kind of thought, because obviously this is so subjective and so open to bias, but we're trying to imbue objectivity in something that is so subjective. So I kind of talked about this. We give this session to trainees, and at the beginning of the session we ask, when have you seen medicine harm? And every single person, maybe except one, in one session, raises their hand. And so I think this is important to talk about, because it's not just something that existed in the past. These are things that still occur today. So examples of clinical are kind of, you'll see on the child psych unit. When a child is acting out, they're going to say, I've heard many people say, like, oh, he's probably going to end up in juvie. Just kind of this idea that we can predict which kids are going to be incarcerated and which kids won't. It's very common to hear. This idea of what we talked about earlier, tying back to the earlier question of fit parents. So I once heard an attending say this child was unable to, or the family was unable to afford food, and so the family was losing, or the child was losing weight. And the attending commented that people who are so poor shouldn't be allowed to have children. That's a really common sentiment, you hear it all the time. or meet people with 7 children and they say, well, you shouldn't have so many kids if you can't afford them. That's a very common thing to be said by doctors. There's often the idea of sterilization, and this comes a lot in psychiatry. For example, we have a unit where there's a patient who is psychotic, and she had lost 3 children because of her psychosis and DCF involvement, and she was pregnant again. And a colleague said to me, well, you should put an IUD in her, and she doesn't know. And so there's this idea of who's fit to be a parent. And then the idea of research is really important. A lot of patients come into us at Yale New Haven Hospital and will say, don't take my blood, I don't want you to experiment on me. Or have this idea of experimentation. And at first, kind of people say they're just paranoid or they're just cautious, but New Haven did experiment on these people, Yale did experiment on these people, so these are real, valid fears that often will impair patient care because we need to get blood to monitor. For example, I had a cancer patient, we needed to monitor their blood count, and they said, I'm not going to give my blood. Another is a restraint use among marginalized patients at Yale New Haven Hospital. There was a study that was done that found that Black men had almost double the rates of restraint use. And a prominent physician said that if you control for perceived aggression by nursing, restraint use was equal. So this idea of objectivity when the assessment is subjective, right? Because obviously biases influence how we perceive aggression. So the last few slides I'll go over is clearly eugenics permeates our thinking, it permeates medicine, it permeates academia in the way that doctors are taught. So how do we use an anti-eugenics framework? And this is a lot of the work that we do. The first is kind of recognition, that we recognize that eugenics is a learned framework and pattern of thinking that's imbued in our universities and the way we learn. The next step is it's not a historical relic, it shapes current medical and academic practices very currently. The next is that this necessitates a fundamental transformation in the way knowledge, power, and authority is conceptualized. And that starts at institutions like Yale. The second is how do we reframe? The first is we prioritize the lived experiences of patients, and we view them as equal knowledgeable individuals in their care. We challenge rigid diagnostic systems and hierarchical structures, where we view diagnoses are not seen as definitive labels, but as tools to guide patients in their mental health journeys. I recognize that the DSM diagnosis is very, very imperfect. Only in the same patient case, if 2 psychiatrists come to the same case, only 20 to 60% will agree on the diagnosis, depending on the diagnosis, so very low. So realize that this is often a subjective field, and we're trying to add objectivity, and distinguish between the subjective and objective, and embrace uncertainty in diagnosing and treatment plans, and foster collaboration, humility, and flexibility. But I think the last part is so important, is that doctors should be challenging systems, academics should be challenging systems. So we should confront and dismantle systemic inequalities, and we should make a shift towards pathologizing systems and not people. And there's a Palestinian psychiatrist who writes that PTSD is a Western concept, because how do you have PTSD if trauma is ongoing, during, and constant and occurring every day? The system is pathologic, war is pathologic, and that stress in war is a normal anticipated response, right? So we need to stop pathologizing people who are having normal responses to pathologic systems. And the last is to challenge training in educational systems in academia. I think it's important to know that eugenics takes root in a place, the earlier demonstration with Dr. HoSang, that it takes root in places like Yale, and it is through a place that eugenics is articulated and legitimized. But I think that means that we can also view place as a site of disruption and resistance, and resist kind of these frameworks, resist these thinkings to bring about change. So that is my section, and I will turn it on over. Woo.
Thank you, Alana. There's so much to think about the past and what's to ahead. Our last short section, I'm going to welcome Marco to talk about something similar, the kind of impact, the long impact of eugenics in K-12 education and the way educators are contesting that. This is a tour from a couple of years ago that students led, students from visiting high school. They took them on the Anti-Eugenics tour, they had tabletop discussions. It was interesting because the students were like, none of this surprises us about Yale, even though this was presented as like you'll never believe this. Students about right today. But we've had students and K-12 teachers come in through these sessions. Elsa was here earlier, but was at Hill House developing anti-eugenic lesson plans for students in their respective classes, high school and elementary school students, another one, another high school, and then workshops in schools. New Haven Academy, where Marco has taught for many years until his more recent position. So we've asked Marco to, this is the last one, and then again, bringing teachers into the archive. This is teachers visiting the Beinecke, and I want to say also the archivists at the Beinecke, opening the room, especially for the teachers, setting out all the materials so they can navigate them, and then the teachers being able to have discussions. How does this show up in the psychology, in your, for social workers? How does it show up in history teaching? How does it show up in a wealthy suburban school in Fairfield County? How does it show up in the kinds of testing we do? So teachers getting to process this together is part of the aspiration. So Marco is going to do a little more kind of conversation. We've asked him to talk about kind of why this is important to teachers, what he's learned as a teacher, and how educators are engaging this. And if you want to just do it from there, Marco. Yes. Okay. Great. Everybody, Marco.
So the first thing I'll say here during the presentation, it's just like the plug and play of insert K-12 education and a lot of the patterns are just the same. So legacies of eugenics and K-12 education, you can try to synthesize this in a way that makes sense. First and foremost is just the testing, categorizing, using these categories to then determine who's superior, who's inferior, and then justifying those decisions on pretty much everything. For every test, especially your standardized ones, and I'll speak to the rating test because that's what's my program here. It's like proficiency, exemplary, and the red category, and the yellow category. Take these to their department, and then you separate these into clusters, honors, developing, and all these things. And then these categories move to subcategories what's higher. You have coded words like urban, developing, predominantly black and brown, and you can just say that there's just this code that comes with these things, right? So testing, categorizing, and then using this to justify decisions on the ground. And then there's more subtle things in the teacher level. In the teacher pedagogy, you go to the traditional route where it's taught just like standard things like that. Spinning. Here's my desired results. Here's how to break it apart, and here's a sequence of the way to get that. But the desired result is based on things like here's advanced placements, or it's this random subset of stuff that we were fooled to believe that this is what intelligence is, when it's just one way of looking at it. And now you have a whole sequence that's based on this specific thing, right? You have whole schools and classes that are based off reading tests that are flawed. But again, you have teachers who are really competent, passionate, and well-meaning and sequencing these things over a flawed test result. So again, going back to the testing, categorization, and doing all these things. And then finally, there's just no teacher will say, I love standardized testing, like I love doing this, or I love teaching AP format, that's exactly how I'm sure our teachers love doing this. But there's this notion of like, I want to do other things, but look at these scores. I want to do these fun things, but look at this. Where all of a sudden it's these scores, these tests, these categories, that all of a sudden take the foundation over the decision making of teachers. So teachers are left in this mode of like, this isn't feel right, but I gotta do it, and I don't really know have language for it, but I think I gotta do it. And then all of a sudden, when this is specifically learning the eugenics or being part of the collaborations of this, and learning the histories of this, and learning what this discomfort is, it's not just an emotional thing. It is an organized, systemic, racist, everything issue stemming back centuries, and that's the undercurrents that teachers are pursuing it and trying to fight against, but don't really have the tools or language or understanding to really make that specific. So in making that specific history and learning this, I now understand what like the battle is. Like there's just the catharsis that's there, and like look at this. Like, none of us are looking at documents and smiling. None of us are like she's doing all these presentations and like these specific things, right? Well, all of us in these specific areas can studies. And I just think about that tree with the roots, with all the disciplinaries that's there, and then it structures the school, and that exact thing was this tree, except the brains are now classrooms, and it's doing this thing where every disciplinary area, there's a set supposed to what makes a really good student, or what is a scholar, or what is an academic, and then these experiences that are flawed being also specific part. So, in doing this in a lot of consciousness alongside other teachers, that's the important part, okay? Where that notion where it's like, I don't really know what else to do because there's this test, but now it's like, I have language to understand exactly what is wrong with this specific testing. Okay? And what we're not going to do is like uproot everything because ultimately we saw 120 students who cycle through with like regulations like trauma, social media, justice work, like everything that we're doing that's there. So it's not going to like an anti-Eugenics student workshop for 2 ninth graders that's not really going to solve much, right? But what are different ways that we collectively, especially when it's using teacher satellite spaces, have the ability to bounce ideas off each other, have ideas to understand our own studies, and unearth and unlearn what that is, and then all of a sudden make steps in order to do so. Because once we learn to unlearn what we have, and really learn history, learn our disciplinary, and then make moves against, then maybe collectively we can actually make some type of change. Okay? But again, we have the onslaught and undercurrents of so much of what's already embedded in traditional education that we're navigating, and who has time on Saturday evening to really do this, especially when you're near around the second involved in that specific thing, right? So who really has the time? So in this work, the importance of just like unlearning history, understanding the origins of these specific things, and then really understanding the importance of collaboration. Understanding is we're going to do the best that we can do for what we have and what we know. We're not going to do sort of blind eye to history because it's going to be easy for us. What we're also not going to do is sit there when we're trying to navigate the whole thing covering class. And the onslaught of students and doing all the duties of teachers while having this eugenics tree inside our room and our minds and like having existential crises and all these things. So the importance of collaboration and being able to bounce ideas is one of the biggest takeaways in our students doing things. In my own practice, for instance, a subtle thing that's like understanding grading, for instance. What defines what an academic grade is, or what is it considered someone who excels, right? Overnight changing the whole grading system of the school system as no, great. Well, understanding really specific things. For instance, in my room, I can practice for students in terms of their own deadline. Here's the parameters, check out what you can and can't do. When can you do this? Okay? And based on that, that's when we meet the deadline, and then we have a conversation about what that does. Separating behavior from academics work and writing clear rubrics and teaching students exactly how to guide them through what a grade is and why they're getting this. There's a huge difference, for instance, when a student writes like your standard grade response, analyzing evidence, and all these things. Here's what you're being graded in this specific format. This is not saying whether you are or not good writer. This is how you perform on this specific thing. And unlocking even that consciousness goes in line against eugenics, because what's happening there is there's no standardization that you're forced to believe that this is what intelligence is. There's no random IQ and hodgepodge of stuff that all of a sudden, oh, I'm smart about this. No, here's this very specific thing. Here's how I'm asking you understand. Now we're going to go off this shared language. So even this in classrooms, like even though the grades aren't high or whatever this is, everyone still has a collective experience, and that's when stress reduces, and it's all there when that consciousness grows. So to circle that again, legacies consist of standardization, making decisions, what in every academic area, and then the important aspect of a teacher is to be able to learn history of this, study and learn academic disciplines, and put it in the conversation of what their practice is. Because teachers can really, and thoughtfully, and willfully, and enthusiastically love their students and adhere and push into progressive systems that exist to also stop regulation of students. I think that's it.
Thank you, Mark. And so just quickly, and just invite a question or two, that we've really learned, we're always on the lookout, where is anti-eugenics work happening? It's happening everywhere. It's happening in just how our process is. The framework and the history gives some sense of where it came from, because we don't have that. We just think, gosh, my school, my supervisor, or something else.